Hi everyone, welcome to yet another video this week where I've got someone special here with me today. Well, the topic that I'm going to talk about is the basics of photography, which is the understanding of your shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO. And to help me with that, I've got someone special here with me. And this person has been with me since Dubai, where I started my photography. She has been my child model, but now she's grown up to be a teen. And let me introduce you without waiting any further. Okay, she's taking time. And yeah, she's my, what are you, my niece? I don't even know what you are. And yeah, she's with me, going to help us learn the basics. I'll try to use her to basically show you the aperture, the shutter speed, and she'll be our model for today. So let's get on to it, and I'll show you what's coming next. So before we get the model to stand in front of us, what I'll teach you is the basics of the photography. So the shutter speed, basically, if you tend to increase it to sort of 1/60th or 1/200 of a second, then it sort of darkens the whole image. While on the other side, get it to 1/60th or 1/30th of a second, for example, it will brighten up the image. But between those two factors, it also gets the brightness into factor, because as you increase the shutter speed, it also darkens your image. But if you decrease it, it sort of, gets it lighter. But also the shutter speed is good to use when you have fast moving objects. For example, if you're doing sports, then you want to make sure you're increasing your shutter speed to like 1/200 or even 1/400 of a second. But if you're doing like a motion blur of like moving objects like a bus or any vehicle for that matter, or even animals, then you want to have a slow shutter speed. So 1/60th, 1/50th is working quite good. So that's basically the understanding of shutter speed. The next we have is the aperture. So the aperture, again, 1.4 or even 1.2 is, in other words, having the aperture wide enough so you get a nice blur at the back, but it also means that you're allowing a lot more light in it. But if you increase the aperture to something like 2.8 or even 3.4 or 4.5 for that matter, that means you are introducing more of the background in, so that will be still in focus, but it also darkens the image. So again, depending on what you're shooting, if you're doing landscapes, then a higher aperture number is always nice, like a f7 or f11 gets you the whole image or sharp. While if you want to do a portrait, then something like a 1.4 or 1.2 is really good, because it gets your subject right in focus while the background is quite blur. The last part is the ISO. The ISO is something that you want to touch right at the end. So if you need a bit more light, then you're going to increase the ISO to like 200, 400, 800, depending on the amount of light you want to have. And if you are looking at cutting off light, then 100 is the minimum that you could start off. So that's where you want to make sure. So the rule is basically to ensure that you are looking at the shutter speed first. Depending on that, then you move on to your aperture to see how much light you want to have, and then the last bit is the ISO. So now that we've understood the three bits, I'll show you into practice what we can do and how we can achieve great photos using these three techniques. Okay, so I've got Michaela now in frame, and I'm going to do some test shots. So I'll start by first explaining how the shutter affects your photo, then we'll go up to the aperture, and then we'll go down to the ISO. So to start with, I've got the shutter here at 1/25th of a second. I'm going to use the f1.4 for my aperture, which is what the lens is, and I'll keep it on ISO 100, and I'll see how it affects the photo. So let's take a test shot first. So Kyla. Okay, so I've got this beautiful shot here now. So it's still very nice, but it's quite bright, as you can see. And what I can then do is I'll try to increase the shutter speed now to show you how it can cut off the light and get you a perfect exposure. So let me just do that. So I'm going to do it at 1/250th of a second, and I'll see how it affects the photo. So let's click 1. Okay, there you go. So that's a quite very nicely exposed photo at 1/250th of a second, kept it at 1.4, and I still have the ISO at 100. So that's quite nice. Let's move on to the aperture next. So with the aperture, I've got it at 1.4. I'll increase it to something like 4.0 next, and I'll show you how it affects the photo and the brightness. So I'm going to keep it at, let's have a look. So I'm going to keep my shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. I'm going to increase my aperture to 4.0. I'm still going to keep my ISO at 100 and let's see what it does to the image. So let me click one there. Okay, so as you can see, it's got quite dark, so again it's quite underexposed, won't able to use it. So the way you want to increase that is to basically try decreasing the shutter speed. So I've already got it to 1/60th. I can try 100. Anything lower than that, I could be adding motion blur to the image, and I don't want that to happen for a portrait photo at least. So I'll try with 100 and I'll see what light it brings in. So let me just do that. So I'm going to click one more. Okay, so it's still underexposed. So the next thing is to increase the ISO. So let me do that. I'm going to increase my ISO next to, say, ISO 640, and let's see what it does to the image. So let me click on that. This one. Okay, so it's still very overly exposed, so that's telling me the ISO is a bit too much. So I'm going to drop it down to ISO 320 now, and let's take a shot. Okay, so that one's really exposed nice now. So that was with ISO 320. So as you notice, if I had a higher ISO, it adds a bit more light, which is making it quite unusable. But if I lower the ISO, it sort of brought in the perfect exposure. So that's what you want to achieve. So if, for example, you are clicking a building or an architecture, so 4.0 is just going to get it sharp to the focus point that you have. But if you increase the aperture, it's going to add in a bit more sharpness to the whole image. So I'm going to try doing that now with this one, and so I'm going to increase my aperture to something like f11, and you'll notice the background blur that was there on the previous photos will be gone, and may also look a bit dark, but then we'll try to adjust the other settings to get a perfect exposure. So let me take one shot now. So I've got this shutter at 100, f11, and the ISO at 320. So let's take a shot. Okay, so it's quite windy there. Okay, so as you can see, it's got quite dark. So the next thing I'm going to do is just increase my ISO, and I'm going to go all the way to ISO 150, so 1250. So let me click one shot there. Okay, so it still is looking underexposed, so I'm just going to increase it further just so you get an idea. So I've got it at ISO 2500 now, and let me just click a shot. Okay, so that's looking quite well exposed. So that was with the ISO 2500, but you'll also, the main thing to notice is the background blur. As you can see, it has added up a lot more background in it, and obviously the subject along with that. So you get the whole image sort of quite in focus, which is really good for architecture or something that you want to be clicking, like anything other than portraits, because portraits, it's always nice to have a shallow depth of field. So anything less than 4.0 is quite good, but this one, as you can see, it has got most of it, everything in frame. So the idea is to basically get a balance between each of those to get the perfect exposure, and depending on the subject as well, what you're shooting. Okay, so that's all I really had to share with you all, and I hope you all learned something there. As you know, COVID-19 has brought in a lot more photographers, and obviously they've brought in their new cameras, but the main understanding of the shutter speed, ISO, and the aperture is something very important to know for every new photographer out there. And I thought of doing this video and hope it helps, and if it did, make sure you leave me a like and let me know your thoughts, and I'll be happy to hear from you. So it's getting quite windy, as you can see, so Michaela and self are going back home, but before we do, she has a small message for you all. And Michaela, you want to say something?
Subscribe to our channel.
Alright, so yeah, if you haven't yet, please do subscribe to my channel, and as you know, it motivates me to create much more videos like this for you all. Hope to see you all next week in my other videos, and until next time, as I always say, keep practicing and keep clicking.